New on midday, GE Appliances is teaming up with Texas Instruments to power its next generation of smart laundry machines. According to GE, the company will use TI microcontrollers, Wi-Fi chips, and other parts in a new laundry plant at its Louisville headquarters. TI will supply about 1/3 of the chips used in those products. That's about double what GE Appliances spends with the company now. Both companies say making more of these semiconductors in U.S. facilities helps strengthen the domestic supply chain while delivering smarter, more efficient, and connected washers and dryers for American consumers.
We are very excited about bringing TI technology into American homes through the partnership that we have with GE Appliances. TI is one of the largest manufacturers of analog and embedded semiconductor products.
Production will start next year. The new facility will be at the GE Appliance Park on Buchel Bank Road.